Hi, we're Bonnie and Greg Dixon with Jerry Smith for Health Pioneer Theater, and today, okay, Bonnie, what is our subject today?
Marta Boyette. And also we have, and Jerry, help me out here.
It's Rodale, Robert Rodale.
Robert
Rodale.
Rodale. Oh my goodness. I will say something here, Jerry. I loved gardening so much when I had 2.5 acres, and I followed Rodale and all the tips and the books, and I just loved him. It really made my heart sing to do gardening. And so what's interesting to go from a home garden to commercial gardening, and what does that mean for us that eat all the produce that's grown somewhere else, not on our own property? And so Marta Boyette, and Amber Dennis really made a huge difference. Huge difference. Now I was in Southern California, Jerry, and they were in Northern Washington or in Washington State. And I would say, having been a retailer down here, I didn't notice the nuance of the produce being organic back in the early 90s that much. But when I moved north in 1994, it was a huge eye-opening experience to move to the Northwest, and their passion for organics, their passion for clean food.
That's a good point, because at a certain point, natural was good enough. And we still have that. You can get natural food, fill in the blank, or you can get organic. And the problem with saying something is organic, actually many scientists dislike that term, because organic in chemistry basically means it's carbon. It has to do with its carbon structure and so forth. So think about going to the store now in Southern California and every place, and how you have a nice seal of USDA organic. And sometimes, and there are gradations below that, which is 95% of the ingredients are organically grown. Well, where did that come from? Well, in 1990, the Congress passed the Organic Foods Production Act of 1990, OFPA. And that standardized and included verification and certification of food growers and producers and manufacturers, so that it meant something. But before that is what we're going to talk about. Because if you delve into it, and Marta is going to talk about it as a Oregon retailer and an Oregon Provender president that year, what standard should you go by? Should you go by the extreme purity standard? Basically, this is a standard of purity in addition to other things. But it's, to a consumer, it's like, how pure is it? Is there a bunch of junk in it? Is there poisons in it? Or was the food grown and let the bugs eat it because I still want it and I don't need the pesticides? So you're looking for something 100% pure? Was that practical? Marta's going to talk about those issues that could have killed the whole concept. Because at that time, there was a patchwork of organic standards. California had one, Oregon had one. In fact, Marta was involved in that, as she's going to talk about. Washington and other states. But they didn't abide by the same definitions and the same standards. So for a really organic to get off the ground, it needed to have a national standard. Now, why? Who cares? What difference does it make? Well, let me tell you something. A small farmer is not going to go organic if he can't sell the stuff, because it costs more. He has higher losses. Obviously, if he's not using pesticides, he's going to have higher losses. And the pound for pound, there's actually studies that show that they get a little more yield by that, but that's after years of cultivation and so forth. So if they have 10 pounds of potatoes and they need to charge $1 a pound instead of 50 cents a pound, they're not going to be in business. So having a organic standard, generally speaking, and some in the audience could probably speak about this much more eloquently than I am currently, they needed a standard that was workable, practical, but a very high standard. And that's basically what we're going to see tonight. Now, following Marta's 15-minute clip, I found another clip that talked about this broad issue in the same year, 1989. And so stay tuned for that, because it features Robert Rodale of the Organic Gardening magazine and the Prevention magazine and so forth. He was interviewed by the USDA, as a matter of fact, and in their oral, I think they call it oral history series. So we've included a clip from that. And really, we take the organic standard for granted. We shouldn't. Pioneers have helped make that a reality, and we owe them a debt of thanks. So why don't we then watch Marta's story, a Provender story, about that.
There was a time when Provender actually played a small role in something that was very important for the nation. And Tilth played a somewhat larger role. But basically, what it came down to is this. In 1988, 89, you might remember there was the big Alar scare where moms were discovering that this really toxic chemical was on the apples in their applesauce that they were giving their babies. And fortunately, we had a celebrity who got involved in that. That was Meryl Streep. Thank you, Meryl. No, I don't know her personally. I just remember that she was a spokesperson about this problem with the apples. And of course, those of us who had espoused eating natural and organic foods for a long time were like, well, yeah, thanks for finally getting on the bandwagon. You know, so we could use a few more voices like that, because it really became big news then that this was a potential problem to be feeding children, me too, stuff that really actually wasn't good to eat. And so out of that, there developed suddenly a much stronger interest in organic food from people who didn't understand what organic food was, but assumed that meant it was without chemicals. And suddenly it was hard to keep organic foods in stock. And of course, growers and manufacturers were scrambling to meet the demand and having a good time doing it, I would assume, as we all were. It's like, wow, we have new customers. This is great. But what happened was it gave some leverage to the awareness that we needed to have a legalized standard for what constituted organic food. We did not have that. It had never existed. It was just sort of a popular understanding or misunderstanding, as the case may be, about what food ought to be. And so the conversation began in various parts of the country. And remember, this is before the internet. This is before you had any way to communicate someone except meeting them, talking to them on the phone, or writing them a letter and sending it in the mail. So some of the conversations were about, we really need to get this codified in law, because right now anybody can put anything on whatever they're growing, bring it to you, and sell it as organic. We don't have any way to prove that it isn't. And so one of the great minds of our time, Lynn Cody, who was also an old friend of mine, who was working as an organic agricultural consultant, and I believe probably still is. In 1989, 1990, she began meeting together with one of our local organic farmers here, Jack Gray of Wintergreen Farm, and they were working out, and Organically Grown Company was also involved. They were working out and drafting proposed legislation at the state level to define organic standards at the state level. And they were both Tilth participants, Oregon Tilth. And I got wind of what they were doing, and I showed up at their meetings and said,
I'm crashing this party.
I'm crashing this party because I'm the president of Provender this year, and manufacturers and retailers and distributors need to be part of this discussion, because we have to have this standard defined in a way that works all the way through the food chain so the consumer knows what they're getting. And they acknowledged that that was a wise choice, and they included me in the meetings. Now, my role compared to theirs was quite minor, because they had already done a lot of the footwork and knew what they were doing at that point. But there were some important contributions that I made as Provender member, and I pulled in Harold Tobin from Serrata Soy Foods, who was at that time with Serrata Soy Foods, to represent the manufacturing side, to point out to them, for example, you cannot say that every single ingredient in an organic food must be organic, because when we make tofu, for example, most of it is organic, but we're using water. The water has to be described some way, and we can't call the water organic. And we're using nigari, which is made from seawater, and that's what's used to curdle the soy milk into tofu. It's only about 0.5% of the finished product, but it's in there. And we can't label seawater organic. There's no way to define that. So after several more discussions, we were able to include in the legislation a better definition of what growers would do, what the farmers would do that could be called organic, what retailers would do in order to be called an organic retailer, of which there are a few, and what food processors or manufacturers could do, and how they could label things, and what percentage of non-organic product could be in something that was called organic, and what sort of non-organic ingredients were permissible. And that all got worked out, and it was a pretty good law, and we took it to the Oregon State Legislature, and by golly, they passed it, first shot. And we had
It was very well written.
and we had a consumer who showed up at our last meeting and chimed in and said, I want to know that we're going to know X and Y as consumers when this is done. And we realized we couldn't promise that. And Lynn started talking about, and this is the first time I had heard the word that is now everyone's catchphrase, which is sustainability. Lynn started explaining that what we had to do was we could not label something organic as being chemical free. That was the point, because there are also organic chemicals like rotenone.
Uranium's organic.
Yeah, uranium is, yeah, well, there are naturally occurring biological agents that are used in organic farming, but the difference is they do not persist in the environment. They break down very quickly into non-toxic substances, and they don't deplete or damage the soil, water, or air. And so she began using, and this is the first time I'd ever heard this used, she started using the term sustainability to talk about what organics was about. So from that point on, I began promoting both within Provender and on a broader level, the idea of selling organics not as something that had an absence of pesticides, but as something that was promoting sustainability in a holistic way, where the land, the air, and the water are cared for. So the following year, an effort was convened on the national level to draft organic standards legislation. And while that was going on, an interesting thing happened within the industry. A major retailer in the Northeast, who shall remain nameless, came out in all the trade journals with their op-ed opinion about how the legislation that was being drafted was going in the wrong direction. They were saying that what we needed was to be able to assure our customers that organic food was chemical-free, period. And there's no way to guarantee that. There can be pesticide drift, et cetera, et cetera. You hope it's minimal, but whatever. Anyway, there was no way to guarantee that. And this got published in the trade journals. And I, as the Provender president, was, that would totally wreck everything we're trying to do. It's not practical, for one thing. You cannot guarantee that there was never any kind of chemical that got near your field.
In the background.
You can do your best, but you can't guarantee that by the time it gets into the apple bin, that someone hasn't touched it somewhere along the line with a trace of chemicals on their fingers, whatever, in the air. And so that's not the way to describe it. Even though it's more likely to be chemical free, that's not the way to describe it unless you want a whole lot of lawsuits going on.
And it's not the whole story.
Yeah, and it's not the whole story. It doesn't really describe what we're trying to do, where we're going. So this was still back in the day, no internet and no electric typewriter even. I mean, they existed, but I didn't own one. And there was no one else around to take up this charge, so, and in fact, that was the year where for several months I wasn't working in a regular job, so I didn't have a business to call on for their resources. And I sat down with an old clunky manual typewriter and I composed a letter that I wanted to go to every retailer and person in the industry, that just as that trade journal had done. And then I took the letter to Sundance because I thought they would help. Thank goodness for Sundance Natural Foods. I talked to David Resegi and he said, I think I can get you a printout of most of the retailers in the country. I'm like, you can? I don't know how he did it. But he did give me this long list, and I sent it to every retailer that I could find, hundreds of people. This is me making photocopies by hand, stamping letters, writing addresses, sending this everywhere. And I sent it also to the people who were drafting the legislation, so they would be in the, included in every step of the conversation. And I sent it, one of the people I sent it to was Tom Forster, who was actually in Washington, D.C., working to lobby for this. And he was so kind as to send me back a letter, because I told him when I sent it to him, I've sent this to all the people in the industry I can find. Please get on board with what you're trying to do. And these are the reasons. And I was able to say, in the Northwest, we are fortunate to have created, and I called it a vertical integration of ideas in our industry. The retailers, the manufacturers, the distributors, and the growers are talking about what works and what doesn't, and what our customers need to know, and what our overall view is. And we're looking at this holistically. What we want to focus on is creating sustainability, not avoiding chemicals. And I was much more eloquent than that. And I sent it everywhere. I sent it to Tom Forster. I told him I'd send it everywhere. I got a letter back from him that said, thank God you're doing that. He said, I can't believe that op-ed that came out. He said, it really is getting in our way, because people will listen to that unless someone like you talks to them. So I was very glad for that, and I felt like I played a small role in getting all the players on board with what had to be done. So.
And that's really that's another thing that I like about this group, about having Provender as a resource, is that you're not the only person who has a story like that.
Right.
Like, people feel that the very atmosphere, or the fact that Provender's there and the context within which Provender operates empowers people to do that. Well, okay, so this isn't working, so what can we do about this? What can you do? And people will say, okay, I will do this part, I will do this part. And you were right at home in that kind of environment, because you're the kind of person who says, well, I have to say something about this. I can't rest unless this is taken care of. And there are other like-minded people who are with you with that, like Craig Winters, some of the other folks that we worked with over time, that really stood up and said, hey, wait, no, here's where we need to be. Here's how we need to frame this argument, or here's how we need to to put this because it's more than just this granular little piece of product.
Right, like the retailer from the Northeast had looked at it through one particular lens, and I had been fortunate because of the connections we built in the Northwest to see it through several different lenses throughout the food distribution system, and go, oh, that is not going to work.
And here you are advocating for junk in the food.
Yeah.
You know,
Not really, but
right,
yeah.
I know, but it puts you in this weird position. But because you had this context around you, and you had people behind you that said, "Yes, Marta, yes," that also helps. And you had David. David stepped up and said,
Thank goodness.
"Oh yeah," and so I think that there still is a place for that. There still is a place for an
Grassroots?
organization like Provender that tells people you have permission. You have permission to go out and make something change, and we will stand with you. We will stand with you if you're supporting this concept of like the web. Of us being connected together, and sustainability, and well-being and health in all areas, not just in food or in your pocketbook, but in your psychic and your whole mental health. And as I'm rambling off, rambling, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So that it's in that context that having permission to do as an individual an important work, knowing that you have these people behind you.
Yeah.
Wasn't that
No.
interesting?
The dedication. It's the dedication of people who really, really care that made such a difference for the entire U.S.
I don't think Marta's ever told that story publicly. In fact, in case somebody's wondering, I had to drag her and threaten with death and torture to even have her sit down for this interview. And I'm really glad I did. And it made her happy, I think, to recall those earlier struggles.
Mm-hmm.
But and we as the public have benefited from that
Yes.
greatly. Now, I wanted to address maybe some of the more controversial issues briefly before we see Rodell's interview, because he touches on that. And that is the term sustainability. So is that a euphemism in the sense of a compromise? Well, if you're involved in agriculture more, you understand that, and closer to the farmers and the producers and so forth, that conventional food producers can't just jump whole hog just immediately into organic. They're I believe it's 3 years in the transition, sometimes more in that general category, where they make a transition. And so you see sometimes in good stores with produce, they put transitional apples and so forth. So the land has to be kind of go through a purification process so that they can have minimal or no use concurrently for 3 years and maybe more, and so forth, so that the soil has the time to heal, so to speak. And that's true of also in animal husbandry. So if you go to a site called, I would say, SARE.org, SARE, this is the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. And I would, for my casual review of the site, it's geared toward food producers who want to make that transition, the pros, the cons, the hows, and so forth. So this leads us to what Rodell had to say about it in his interview. Sustainability was actually created by a French named English woman in the mid-40s who first started using the term. Now, she had a much higher level of purification as her object, but the soil sustainability is what the real bad news is for lots of synthetic approaches to soil management and for extreme production methodologies. And that's really a realistic term. So keeping that in mind, let's here in 1989, in the middle of the USDA interview, Rodale's 9-minute comments about those issues and beyond what he saw as going down the road 50 years and where we're at now, 34 since he recorded that, and 33 since the law was passed in the United States. So let's listen to Robert Rodale's interview.
I prefer the idea of a regenerative agriculture. I don't like really, I'm not satisfied with the term sustainability. I think it's very appealing to policymakers and scientists because they think it's simple and they can understand it. But the public, it doesn't, I don't think average person aspires to live in a sustained environment. They want to live in something that's expanding and going better. So I think the idea of regeneration is more appealing, and it is also much more fruitful in an inventive scientific concept to point the way to opportunities. And so basically what we have is today two separate, rather distinct kinds of farming, which broadly speaking the alternative groups are working on. It's very poorly understood that there is this distinction even by scientists who, some do and some don't.
There is a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
But you're saying that on the one hand there are people who are practicing organic farming in the sense that your father meant it.
Oh, there's a lot. Yeah, the organic farming movement today is very vital, and it's successful, and it's defined. People ask me, like, what exactly is organic farming? I say, okay, look in the laws of California, Minnesota, New York, whatever. Soon I think there'll be 20 states that will define exactly what organic farming is in that state. We hope the federal government will do that in a national way. It's important for consumer protection and also for guidance of producers. So that's clearly defined, but the less clear is what is sustainability and what is regeneration. It's laughable when you talk to conventional scientists today, and they say, well, the ball is in your court. Define sustainable agriculture. What is it? And so people start saying sustainability is this, that. Nobody's ever asked them, what is conventional agriculture? Define that. And the definitions are important, but they're not of overriding importance. I mean, you could just go out and do it. And it's used as a very crude escape hatch for people like the scientists who are the leftovers, who are not going to make it in the future, who say, when you can define sustainable agriculture, so I agree with it, then I'll do it. But I'm not going to do it until you can convince me, or there is an agreed upon definition. And that's just ridiculous. Nobody said define, I'm not going to do biotechnology until you define biotechnology. All their favorite little buzzwords, they don't insist on definitions on. But it is important, I think, that society have a pretty clear idea of where it's going. But see, we're at a time of confusion and transformation now. And I think what is going on is we are shifting the big ideas that drive American agriculture. This is a speech I gave a couple days ago to landscape architects. The first, they're like either big ideas or imperatives. The first idea of American agriculture was settlement.
I'm sorry, they're either big ideas or imperatives?
Imperatives,
okay.
Like concepts that must be accomplished. America spent 100 years settling the land to prove that Westerners could live here. Then we went into an expansion phase, like the mid-1700s to mid to late 1800s. We knew we could live in America, but we didn't know if we could expand into the West and all over. So about 1859, when Lincoln gave that speech, it was the beginning of the industrial phase of agriculture. And there are facilitators to each of these phases. The facilitator of the settlement phase was the explorer. The facilitator of the expansion phase was the sheriff, the U.S. Marshal, and the U.S. Army.
The settlement phase being the original settling of America.
You had to have an explorer first to show you where the land was. Then you settled it. And you had to have the U.S. Army push back the Indians before you could settle the West. And the facilitators of the industrial phase were the land grants. You had to have the professors to tell you how to make the machines.
The land grant universities?
The land grant universities and their specialists. So we're now just about at the end of the industrial imperative of American agriculture. And we don't know exactly what the next one will be. It'll probably be sustainability. We know we can produce a lot of food, and we now know that we can produce in America a tremendous amounts of food with a much less industrial system, using internal resources, not as much fertilizer, pesticides that are very much less or evaporate in a short time. And my contention, which is that the facilitators of this sustainable imperative are not going to be the land grants. They fought against it, and there's no way that they can invent new ideas because they're so specialized. So the facilitators of the sustainable period are what I call systematicians. There are some people now, this is why at the Rodale Research Center we are focusing on systems research. And we're not only inventing systems, but we're inventing the craft of systems theory in agriculture. And there's other people doing it too, but the only people who can help sustainable agriculture are those who think beyond their one discipline. And it could be, usually these imperatives of American agriculture last for 100 years. My hope is that the period of sustainability will not be sustained for more than 10 or 15 years, but that we will move beyond that into the idea of regeneration, where what we're really doing with the American land is not only producing our food, but regenerating and improving, reforming to a higher level the American landscape and the American spirit. And the facilitators of that imperative will be what I call meta-systematicians. People who there's not one that exists right now, but they're people who know systems theory and the whole system of growing food and living, but can also carry it beyond into the spirit as well.
I sense that you feel optimistic for the future, that you would like someone viewing this film in 50 years from now to be talking from a meta-systematic viewpoint or watching from that viewpoint.
Right. Well, I'm very optimistic. I've always been an optimist, and I think this is a time of tremendous optimism. Should be for everybody. Like the headlines, like we're trying to cut all this money out of the defense budget. We're fewer stealth bombers, and
we're seeing a lot of changes in the world, not just in the U.S. government.
Okay, so we're going to do some more video at another time on this great little gem that I found, because Rodale is really a founder, the Rodale dynasty. Although they both died young, oddly enough. He mentions that his father had a heart murmur, so that may be why. They basically, they were both good marketers. And you know what? if you don't market it to the American people, they probably are not going to adopt it because it's the right thing to do. They have to be sold. That seems to be the American way in general. So what's good to notice that I don't want to forget is that if you go to the RodaleInstitute.org site, Rodale Institute, and there was a trust set up, he mentions, decades ago, many decades ago, and no college or university would support it. The money just laid fallow there, but not so anymore. And the title page of this is "The Future is Organic." Rodale Institute is growing the regenerative organic movement through research, farmer training, and consumer education. So there's kind of a give and take on the subject. And we still debate this in the sense of having a non-GMO certification. If you actually go to an organic certifier, they'll say, well, that's already a given. If they're certified organic, they can't be genetically modified. Not that I'm advocating either point of view, but sometimes the waters get muddy, and it's good to kind of review our terminology. In any case, sustainability is somewhat less of a commitment to ultimate certified organic standards, but often it is not only the path to that standard, but the result of that standard. So that's kind of what my takeaway on this was. Well, we're going to have more next week on a different subject or the same. We are going to decide, but we want to make sure that you remember to subscribe to get your weekly email link to the show. And you can get there with the bit.ly link there or the direct link. And when you sign up, all you have to submit is your name and your email address. And you might remember to, because of email trying to protect you from all those evil email marketers, to include Greg Dixon at Shared
Visions.
Thank you. sharedvisions.com, so that it won't put it in your junk mailbox. And Greg does that function for us, and we try to get that out a day or two early so you can pass that around. And that link is different each week, and that's the point. So just sign up there on the Natural Health Movement page, and you won't miss an episode. And better yet, you can watch it on demand if you can't make it at live, and that's true through that link. And also, they're collected on the Natural Health Movement in the Natural Health Pioneer page and our YouTube page as well. So you have a good evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
See you next week. Make sure to sign up.